Good morning. I need to get dressed. Clearly, I'm doing my makeup. The seasons are changing, so I need a new foundation. This is Dior. I really like Dior. It's like one of my favorites. I know that this is kind of similar to Maybelline or maybe even Revlon, so I'm not really like a makeup hype guru. And I'm speaking in this low tone because one, it's the morning time. I'm trying to be a little bit more zen, but I'm also feeling like a little groggy, but that's not the premise of the video. The premise of the video is this is just more so a video that I'm making like to just kind of send my, I don't know, I'm just more so saying how I feel for so many Black successors who have to go in white spaces and explain their trauma and like share their trauma and their upbringing about the crack epidemic because of Ronald Reagan, and you have to go and explain that to white people. And I'm more so having compassion for a lot of Black successors who come back and have to share their stories and talk about, things that are low-key, I don't know, like there's this common thread as of late, especially with, Black people, Black women specifically in corporate spaces. The common narrative is, oh, it's a white male dominated field. And don't get me wrong, like I'm sure there are white male dominated fields, but there are white women fields as well. And I just think that we're kind of in this space right now where we're just saying, let's come together as women, and we're in this together as women, and we're just not. You know what I mean? It's not a white male dominated field. Okay, it is white people dominated field. And this brings a bit of a concern to me because, again, it goes back to this false sense of allegiance that has swept through America and that has pretty much stifled Black people in their communities. And when I say stifle Black people in their communities, I'm just gonna do this is making more sense. I'm more so saying, like, the Black plight to equality was on a one-track train to Georgia, on a one-way train to Georgia, okay? And where we are today, that train has been hijacked. It has been, it's taken quite a few stops. And, we're just not really on one accord anymore. And it's because we've had to take on so many other people's issues. I've kind of noticed this as well with white women and their hatred for men. I don't think that Black women ever really initiated any of these movements. We know, like, from a historical context, even in modern day, Black women have never really been at the plight of, exploiting Black men to such an extent. I mean, I think we did always have communal issues, but a lot of these issues really didn't start to rise until the rise of social media and its comparativeness in terms of like seeing white relationships. Also, I think with psychological terminology being weaponized, right? So a lot of the psychologists were coming out talking about the subtle ways, right? It was very much indirect, but they talked a lot about how Black people were raised in very subtle ways. And because of those cultural differences, a lot of white psychologists started to say that the way Black people were raising their kids was wrong. This is how we got like the weaponizing of the trauma talk and the divorce your family, when we just were never in a position to ever really be collectively divided in such a way. And so that's why you have the integration and the migration rather, and you have the rise of interracial relationships. So that's one thing. The second thing I was going to say is because of the hijacking of the Black progressive movement, so to speak, we're no longer on one accord. So, a lot of white people and a lot of white women specifically have tried to come in and have some relevance in this movement. I really think that this has kind of became more of a Me Too movement, in a sense of me too, like I'm oppressed too, share my story, share my truth, even if it had nothing to do with you, even if you were completely not oppressed. You know what I mean? You have a lot of privileged housewives coming out saying, oh, this is such a miserable life. And you have people who have never lived a life of privilege being able to relate to this narrative, but it's false. It's not a true sense of allegiance. Please tell me, what is oppressed about living in the suburbs with a fat bank account, being able to go to any recreational activity that you want to do, being able to see your kids be in the best communities, the best schools, have the best girlfriends, being able to shop, being able to live a life of leisure? What is oppressed about leisure? I'm just not understanding. And so what you have is a bunch of people who really just kind of want to be heard. And I think that this really kind of went underway as African Americans were kind of waking up. There was a really brief moment where we were all on one accord about racial injustice. We started to be on social media. We started to notice all of the economic inequality within our communities. We started to notice how, you know, you were on TikTok and you've seen white kids and like they were really living plush, and you're like, wow, like, you know, so people started to wake up and notice that. People were starting to, you know, tap into more educational podcasts, especially as it relates to African American history. People were starting to question, you know, why is it that we're living in a country where our history and our books are being banned? You know, why is it that we're living in a country where the only history that is not taught and institutionalized learning in schools is African American history? People were starting to wake up and people were starting to have questions. We started to see the rise with this in the conversations of like consciousness and, you know, things like that. And so there was then there was rebuttal, right? And it was done strategically. It was started to be something that was like debunking, and it was like, oh, this is the woke agenda. These people are X, Y, and Z. And they started to really take Black consciousness or Black awareness or even Black scholarships, like, and they started to take it and weaponize it against us and say, you're being aggressive, or, you know, we need to be more progressive and we all need to get along together. And then this is when you kind of see Black people kind of being on the fence and being like, okay, well, you know, you had a lot of people who had, you know, moved, and people as in Black people moved beyond, let me see, what time is it? Because girl, we ain't really got all day. Okay, I'm just gonna finish up the video. But you've seen a lot of Black people move beyond, you know, like, you've seen a lot of them beat the corporate ladder, and we started to notice that not every Black person was oppressed. Not every Black person had came from, you know, impoverished backgrounds. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I'm just making this video because we can go on and on. I don't have no cliff notes, honey. I don't have no notes in general. I'm just going straight off my dome. But we do, I'm more so just saying I extend compassion to anyone who, as a Black successor, you know, you've made it, you're in a certain space, and you have to explain your background to a bunch of people whose ancestors may have caused that problem, and you have to explain it in a way without telling the whole story. You have to explain it in a way that is really exploitative, and it's more so looked at as mere curiosity for another person. I think that this is probably one of the biggest agonies of being a Black writer, is because you have to tell your story, but you're telling it in a group of people who, you know what I mean, cannot relate to that story. And it feels very exploitative. It feels very much like, you know, it just feels like, it just feels like a very inappropriate setting to tell, because it's like, you know, your voice and your opinions do matter, you know what I mean? But it's like, man, here I am, you know, having to explain this very unique Black experience that will always exist in America, regardless of what we try to do, how we try to finesse it, how we try to get on one, you know what I mean, one accord in terms of like this, the multiculturalism, you know. The Black experience will always exist, and it'll always be a very unique experience. It will be just that, an experience, and it's something that not everyone can relate to. I think we've seen this as well with a lot of, you know, immigrants outside of Mexicans. Obviously, we know that Hispanics and Blacks really go toe to toe in terms of crime, injustice, and racial inequality in America. But, you know, other minorities, you know, coming to America, having their, you know, 2 cents in this, talking about inequality, when we can go to Chicago and we can see Korea, we can go to LA and we can see Koreatown, we can see, and even still, you know, Hispanics are very prosperous in California, but Compton is still Compton, you know, and a lot of people can have a lot of opinions about, well, why Black people don't have their own communities, and why Black people are this, and Black people do this with their money, and Black people X, Y, and Z. But no one's really willing to step back and look at the historical context of African American history. And you know why? Because you are not going to go and sit and read hours of African American literature. You are not going to get this level of wisdom and knowledge and intelligence from simply taking one African American history course in your college, okay, within your collegiate studies. It's just not going to come that way. You're going to have to really go tooth and nail and like read rigorously, okay, because guess what, the information is nowhere out there. Okay. So this is just more so like sending my compassion. I think for me, I know what it's like to have had situations, in my life where I had to, explain to a supervisor or explain to, someone who was not black about what I was going through. And I know that that just felt very exploitative because one, there wasn't any compassion in their eyes. They did not understand. And, I started to notice how with the rise of, integration to the extent that we are integrated today, like when we were on that steep steady hill, we were like, okay, we're gonna integrate with white people in a way that we've never integrated before. I started to notice how a lot of that integration, especially as it related to our white counterparts, was based on mere social experimenting. A lot of people just were so curious about the black experience. Like they just wanted to be down. You have to understand, a lot of people have a lot of fetishized views of black people. They think that it's just the dance, they think it's just the rap, they just kind of like, you know what I mean? You have to look into the minds and peer into white psychology, which is something which very seldom happens, right? We know that it is other cultures that are studied, right? We know because of white supremacy, white people and their culture is never questioned. They're never looked at as a culture. They're never looked at as a very peculiar sense of people who've had this very grotesque history of violence against other people, right? That we don't look at them like a culture whose wealth and overall foundation is founded on exploitation of others. We don't look at them that way. And now we have to kind of like backtrack and say, oh, well, no, we're all in this together when we're not. Black people have a history of community. Black people have a history of love. Black people have a history of soul and creativity, which is really birthed in lack. And that's the one thing that really bothers me about psychology and, psychological studies in regards to human nature, because it never includes the black body, the black life, the black experience. It never does. It's a very, science in itself, intelligence in itself is a very linear path that premises on white people, white culture. And I know when I say white people, it doesn't really land well. And I always said that like these conversations, I never really felt grace for it. But if it's making sense, follow with me. And I said this because I was listening to Janisha's from Kentucky's story on The Atlantic, and I just was listening to her explain how her mom was on drugs and, to this white podcast host, and she's like, what made you want to share this story and so forth. And, it just hit something for me. And we talk about like insensitivity. We talk about how you're explaining something to a person who could never really understand it. And that doesn't make this, a race thing per se, but, it's just, it's a difference in the culture. And I just think that level of shame that black people carry from having very, coming from very deplorable conditions, coming from, a lot of deprivation is a shared experience. And a lot of times we have to be in spaces where that experience is not shared. And so it can be very uncomfortable. And I've always kind of said, I don't think that everybody deserves to know your story. I just don't. I think that when we start talking about our jobs, we start talking about corporations, we start talking about, moving in and out of certain spaces, I just don't think that that's the version of you should bring. I don't, because I don't think that everybody's worthy of your story. You know what I mean? If I'm talking to someone who knows about the history of African Americans and they know about the things that have taken place within our communities that have left us, impoverished, then maybe, impoverished and uneducated, maybe we can have that conversation. You have to understand that I'm standing here where I am today because I forewent, okay? I intentionally, stepped into my independent study. You know what I mean? I intentionally started to ask the right questions about why I was the way I was, where we were, what questions was, you know what I mean? It was only because of that, because of my determination to figure out the truth and who I am and what has taken place, that I was able to come out on the other side. Okay. No black person really comes from privilege. Now, that's a general statement. I'm not going to throw that out there and be like, no black person comes from privilege, because it's not true, right? Not everyone comes from deprivation. There are a lot of people who have been progressive, a lot of ancestors, a lot of, who've stayed together throughout the years and so forth. Not everybody's coming from lack. So let me just say that. Okay. But I'm still saying that the black experience is a very unique experience. And it was really that experience that allowed a lot of black people to have compassion and sympathy for one another and help one another and give back to these communities and work within these communities instead of foregoing these communities, because there was just a collective awareness and understanding of the history and why we are where we are. And, a lot of people don't want to be like, oh, I think a lot of people who are very simple-minded, who are very one-track minded, will hear that statement and say, oh, well, you shouldn't be making excuses for yourself. You know, if you're a Black person, it's not okay to say, you know, you're not going to be successful because, you know, you went through this or your people went through that. That's a very simple-minded thing. You're a very simple-minded person. I need you to hear me right now when I say that's very simple-minded. Now, you know, if we were to flip that, and if I was to come back and I was to be just as simple-minded, I would say, well, you wouldn't be where you are if it wasn't for the work that was put in with your ancestors. And you know what I mean? Then it would be like, oh, okay, well, you know, but that's a true statement. You see what I'm saying? So I think that's the experience with Blackness, and it's this very kindred experience that is no longer shared. It's being exploited. It's being, you know, shared, or rather forced, to be shared with other people. And a lot of people are wanting to relate to that, but not to the grotesque. You know, a lot of people are wanting to relate to the cute, to the cuddly, to the bibbity bop, you know what I mean, to the very surface level kind of like breadcrumb experience of the Black experience. And so if you're wondering, why are we in this place now where we're really divisive? If you're wondering, you know, why you feel shame when you talk about your story. I've seen a lot of people do this, you know, and I think for me, I kind of avoided that because I grew up with the understanding that just like, you know, you don't tell everybody your business. And honestly, I don't think that was a matter of shame, as, you know, a lot of psychologists, I don't think that was a matter of secrecy, as a lot of psychologists would like to kind of coin that term. I don't think it was a matter of secrecy. I think it was a matter of protection and survival. And quite frankly, I think it did me a lot, especially as it relates to my personal self-esteem, to have those elements of secrecy, especially when I'm in, you know, work settings, corporate settings, you know, personal settings, when I'm with other people who cannot relate to this very unique experience. So a lot to unpack this morning, but definitely just my morning thoughts. You know, it hits a little different when you share your story with the people who can relate to that story. You know what I mean? It hits a little different when you know your audience. You know what I mean? And you are received better by that, right? Like, I think that a lot of times when those stories are shared, there's a lack of, the response is often, it's very inappropriate. You know what I mean? People hear those stories and they get inquisitive about those stories. Oh, well, you know, and you start asking questions that are a little insensitive. You know what I mean? So just, you know, I'm just saying that when it comes to certain stories, I think maybe you should try to, you know, share them with the people who can relate to those stories, you know? So I don't know. I don't really think this is a matter of being divisive. I think it's just very unfortunate how, you know, in order for us to be as progressive as we are today, from the liberal standpoint, if you want to talk political, from the progressive standpoint, if you want to, you know what I mean? I don't even know if is that another party? I know we got the liberals, the Republicans, whatever. It's just unfortunate that in order for us to get to where we were today, we had to really forego ourselves and our culture and our experience and our collective experience as African Americans in order to integrate in the way that we have integrated today. You know, we've had to really let go of, you know, who we are and our sense of agency over our stories, our sense of agency over our experiences, over our opinions, especially at this point. And it's just, you know, it's really unfortunate. You know, and you would say, oh, no, everyone has freedom of speech. No, they don't. No, they don't. Who has freedom of speech? You know what I mean? Who? You know, people who have freedom of speech are the people who are saying all the things that everyone else is saying. It is the commonality. It is those who believe that they are, you know, making a difference with such, you know, I don't even know, I would say egotistic views at this point. They're speaking with such authority that you start to believe it, and you think that it comes from a place of truth, and you think that it's, you know, some type of validity, but it's just not true. You know, it's people who think like everybody else, you know, people who have groupthink mentalities. Those are the ones who have freedom of speech. Everyone else, we don't have freedom of speech. Does that sound, you know, am I on here speaking right now? Yeah. You know, and it's because it's through tailoring. It's through years of kind of like cultivation, you know, the raw, rugged, you know what I mean? Speak to the masses, you know, who may not have a certain level of education. You know, that's not a thing anymore. Okay. And even still, when you start talking about corporations, you start talking about, you know, certain things, it's not a thing anymore. So yeah, not everyone has freedom of speech. You know what I mean? Like I said, you know, again, let's not generalize. Let's just think about the question, right? Let's think about the question. Who has freedom of speech, right? Let's not say, oh, you're sitting on this pot, you're sitting on this, you know, you obviously have freedom of speech. Like, obviously I have freedom of speech. Clearly, I have freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want to say, you know, but let's really, really like let's take a critical and analytical view of America today. Let's take a critical and analytical view of the world today. You tell me, who has freedom of speech? Is it the people who are what saying what everyone else wants to hear? Because to me, it sounds like the people who have freedom of speech are those who are the most agreeable. Yeah.